When it comes to storytelling, Dunkirk is a film that falls well outside the norm and deep into that strange realm of experimental filmmaking that at first glance really should not have worked as well as it did. In effect, scrapping most of the usual elements that we tend to associate with good stories like dialogue and character arcs and, an actual plot, and replacing them with a bunch of atmospheric visuals, quiet moments of introspection, and ticking sounds, to create what is essentially a threadbare story about a bunch of guys sitting around waiting to die. And yet, despite all that, Dunkirk still somehow manages to all come together on screen in something that is less a narrative-driven story and much more a speculative look at cinema, that its director Christopher Nolan calls virtual reality without the headset. Or, as I like to think of it, the first 10 minutes of Saving Private Ryan stretched across 2 hours, with slightly less blood. However, while I could spend an entire video in itself on what makes Dunkirk, for lack of a better word, tick, what I would instead like to focus on today is another aspect notably absent from the film, and that is that for almost the entire runtime of Dunkirk, almost zero enemy soldiers are ever actually shown. I mean, sure, we do get to see hints of the German army, with the characters getting attacked by submarines and planes and being shot at by people just off screen, but as far as real actual soldiers go, we don't see a single one until the very end when we get a few quick shots of 2 blurry-faced bad guys. And that really isn't a lot. I mean, considering that Dunkirk is, a war movie with people shooting each other and getting blown up, the fact that Nolan could make a film that goes almost 2 hours and somehow not have more than a couple bad guys even just accidentally wander into the shot seems like kind of an oversight, right? Like maybe when he was throwing out all that dialogue and character development, he just accidentally threw out all the soldiers as well. But given his body of work, Nolan doesn't really strike me as the kind of director who half-asses his way through a film enough that he would miss such an obvious oversight. In fact, if there's anything Nolan can be counted on as a director, it's that one, he will have a meticulously plotted out narrative, whether it's playing with the intricacies of time like in Inception, or playing with the intricacies of time like in Interstellar, or playing with the intricacies of time like in Tenet. And 2, he will very much full-ass his way through that narrative. Also, some of his dialogue will be really hard to hear.
Collins, are you right?
So, given all this, I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that when it comes to Nolan and filmmaking, this was probably less of an oversight and much more of a deliberate choice. Which leaves us with the obvious question, why? What reason did Nolan have for keeping us from seeing a bunch of Nazis getting shot up like a Tarantino fever dream? Well, the answer to this, you'll find, all comes down to the implication.
What implication? The implication that things might go wrong for her if she refuses to sleep with me.
Okay, it's not that implication, but there is an implication here. And to understand what that is, we're going to have to get a little meta. To start, it's important to know that a story is never consumed in a bubble. How we view and relate to any single story is informed at least in some part by those we've experienced before it. It's why, for instance, most of us could guess that a shot like this is probably from a gritty thriller, without knowing its name or what it's about. The same way that most of us could guess that a shot like this is probably from a romantic comedy, and that a movie with a shot like this is going to be shit. It's also why, if asked, most people could give you the general plot outline of a slasher film.
Someone will die.
Of fun.
And of murder.
Because most of these kinds of stories follow a pretty simple framework. Basically, a group of horny teenagers somehow falls under the ire of an evil monster, which then goes on to kill each of them one by one for their sins of having sex, doing drugs, and being black, until only one of them remains, the pure, chaste final girl, who finally decides to fight back.
You just fucked with the wrong virgin.
And defeats the big bad monster in the end. Or so they think. Now, many of you might not know the term final girl, or that scene from the rom-com I showed earlier is known in the industry as a meet cute, but I'm sure that most of you could at least follow along with these story elements as I laid them out. Because whether it's knowing the basic plot outline of a slasher film, or how rom-coms like to have their love interests meet, or that moody lighting and a washed-out color palette is indicative of a thriller, we have unconsciously internalized many of these elements simply through a lifetime of consuming stories. This is, in large part, why we as kids are able to watch the same crappy movie over and over and over again, while as adults we start getting minion nightmares after the second viewing of Despicable Me.
No. Papoy. Ah, Papoy.
It's not just because we've become more jaded as we've grown older, although that probably has something to do with it, but for most of us, the real reason is that as children we haven't yet built up enough of a knowledge base for how stories are supposed to work. So as long as a film has an easily digestible plot and some cute creatures to laugh at, we're doing just fine. However, as we get older and begin to build up this knowledge base, we become much more able to discern whether the show we're watching is actually good or just some hastily thrown together crap to sell us some stuff. And well, this often means that as an adult, trying to go back and rewatch some of those movies we used to love as kids is generally a recipe for disappointment. This implicit understanding of the language of story that we gain over time is still overall incredibly beneficial, because it means that writers aren't forced to re-explain basic story elements every time they want to write something new. For instance, instead of having to recontextualize character roles at the beginning of every story, all a writer really needs to do to show us who's the hero and who's the villain is to dress one of them up in white and another in black, and the audience immediately understands which one's which. See, in a vacuum, there's nothing particularly special about these colors, but due to their historical usage in other stories, we have created a specific meaning around them.
Which would you prefer?
To us, there is an implication behind these colors, and writers can use that implication as a shorthand to quickly acclimate the audience to their story. Essentially, what I'm talking about here is tropes. And while tropes generally do get a bad rap, they are still actually incredibly helpful when it comes to storytelling, because they allow a writer to quickly gloss over basic things like who's the good guy and who's the bad guy, so that they can then jump immediately into more complex story elements. Harry Potter, for example, uses the basic opening tropes that we see in most fairy tales, of a young child being forced into a harsh life of labor under the rule of their evil step-parents as a quick jumping off point before diving into a much more deep and complex narrative. Unfortunately, the downside of this is that tropes often lead to cliches, because like with Minions, the more times you use them, the less entertainment value they hold. 2001: A Space Odyssey, for instance, was a groundbreaking film when it first came out in 1968. But most people these days tend to find it boring and derivative, because since its release, all of those groundbreaking elements it pioneered have been reused and built upon and parodied by so many others that came after it that they've now become nothing more than a punchline. Still, cliches are not entirely useless, because once a trope becomes commonplace enough, writers can then use what the audiences have come to expect from them to manipulate how they view a story. They can, for instance, make an evil character appear to be good by giving them traits that we normally associate with heroes, like dressing them up in white. This is also why all of the friend characters who turn traitor halfway through the story always look so handsome. Because everyone expects the ugly guy to do bad stuff, but the pretty ones, they're supposed to be the good guys. On the flip side of this, writers can also make good guys appear bad by dressing them up in the usual trappings that we've come to expect from a villain. So, for everyone wondering why Snape treats Harry and friends with such a gratuitous amount of dickishness, this is why. It's so that, despite us being told repeatedly throughout the series that he is in fact a good guy, while also actually being shown several times saving Harry from his own stupid mistakes because Harry's a big old dum-dum head who only knows one spell, we still believe he's a baddie up until the very end because he's mean and ugly and probably can't get erections. Now, on top of all of these sneaky little tricks, a writer can use the audience's expectations of the usual cliches to pull story-altering twists by reversing a trope entirely. A classic example of this comes from the first Scream movie, a film that played with a lot of the usual slasher film tropes, like presenting Drew Barrymore as the final girl only to kill her off in the first 10 minutes. Like with Colors, there's nothing specific about Scream's opening that makes it different than most slasher films. Someone always dies in the beginning of every one of these stories. However, what makes this specific scene so surprising is that it kills off the one character who historically isn't supposed to die. At the time of the film's release, Drew Barrymore was at the height of her fame, and she was put front and almost center in all of the marketing for this film, giving us the impression that she would be the star of the show, the one who makes it through to the end. So, when the film opened by immediately killing her off, audiences were, understandably, a little bit surprised. Unfortunately, the downside of all this is that if a writer is not explicitly trying to subvert our expectations of a trope, the implications of that trope can actually get in the way of the story. And this is the exact problem that Nolan faced in Dunkirk when it came to showing enemy soldiers on screen. In this specific case, the issue came down to conflict archetypes. Now, for those of you who don't know, there are 6 fundamental archetypes of conflict that a story can fall into, and they are
man versus man, man versus dog, dog versus zombie, James Bond, stories of kings and lords, women over 50 finding themselves after divorce, and car commercial.
Okay, wait, no, that's, this doesn't seem right. Let me see here. Okay, yes. So here are the actual story archetypes, and I'm going to explain each of them to you now in really the only acceptable fashion for this kind of thing, with examples from Nicolas Cage films.
Hello.
So without further ado, let's jump right into the Nick Cage-aganza.
Okay, let's run.
The first story archetype we have is man versus self, a story where the protagonist's main source of conflict is, obviously, with themselves. It's an archetype we see in movies like Leaving Las Vegas, where Nick goes to Vegas to drink himself to death, and the whole thing just gets more and more depressing from there. But the reason I bring it up is because it's an example that also highlights a philosophical question specific to this story archetype, which is, if in a man versus self story, the character's ultimate goal is one of self-destruction, and they succeed in that pursuit, have they actually won or lost? Just something to think about as we move on to our second story archetype, man versus man, which is essentially any story with a villain. And of course, I should note here that the villain doesn't actually have to be a man, or even human, which is actually the case for all of these story archetypes. All of the terms I'm using here are actually just stand-ins to simplify these concepts. So in the case of the term man, what I'm really referring to here is just any character at all. It could be women, aliens, animals, bees.
Oh, no, not the bees! Not the bees! Ah!
In the case of a man versus man story though, the one trait that all villains do need to have is that they are on relatively equal footing as the hero in terms of power, which is an important attribute that we'll get to in a moment. But as far as man versus man Nick Cage films go, we have Con Air, which features Nick, his luscious locks, and his impeccable southern accent as he takes down a plane full of terrorists.
I said, put the bunny back in the box.
And this leads us to the second note that I should point out here, that the use of the term man as it applies to a man versus man story doesn't necessarily mean that there has to be a single hero or villain. You can have multiple heroes and multiple villains and still have it be a man versus man story. I say this because people might confuse multiple villains with our third story archetype, man versus society, which is less about people and more about a character's struggle against cultural and societal norms, like in the Nick Cage movie Joe, where he faces off against the cyclical power of destruction caused by America's opioid epidemic.
Girl, get your ass off the floor. Quit being stupid.
And like with Leaving Las Vegas, he doesn't fare too well in this one either, because, as it turns out, society really isn't all that easy to change, which is generally why a lot of these types of characters settle on self-sacrifice in order to protect a single victim from that society instead. Or if that doesn't work, you just shoot him in the back of the head.
And I get the Tinder rap.
Now, the fourth story archetype is man versus nature, which is pretty much every survival story ever made, like in the Nick Cage film USS Indianapolis, Men of Courage, a story with one of the most self-aggrandizing titles in the history of cinema, but also has one of the best shark attack sequences since that Samuel L. Jackson one in Deep Blue Sea. It's a pretty simple archetype, really, unlike our fifth story archetype, man versus supernatural, where the protagonist goes up against some kind of powerful deity or otherworldly source like fate or destiny. And here is where we get to the problem of equal footing that I mentioned earlier when it comes to villains. See, in a man versus man story, the two sides are generally equal in power. Of course, the villain usually starts much stronger than the hero, but by the time they face each other in the final battle at the end of the story, the hero will have grown enough to kick some ass and take some names. In a man versus supernatural story though, there's a lot less ass-kicking, because the ultimate goal of the hero here isn't actually to defeat the supernatural element. This is why horror stories generally don't fall under the man versus supernatural archetype, because despite nearly every slasher movie villain being a literal supernatural monster, by the end of the story the characters are able to overcome them by figuring out a weakness that brings the monster down to their level.
You cursed rat! Look what you've done! I'm melting!
Instead, what generally separates a true man versus supernatural story apart here is that they are not so much about overcoming the supernatural element, but instead about learning to come to terms with it. For instance, in the film City of Angels, Nick is an angel who faces off against God to win his humanity. But in doing so, he loses the very reason for wanting to in the first place. However, rather than having him then go all John Wick on God in vengeance, the story is instead about learning what it truly means to be human, and that facing loss is a necessary part of that experience. Now, the last story archetype we have is man versus machine, and honestly the reason I saved this one for last is mostly because I just couldn't find a Nick Cage movie as an example. The best I've got is Gone in 60 Seconds because he's got that weird on-again, off-again relationship with that one car.
No, don't do this. Don't start with me. Start.
But that's not really in the spirit of a man versus machine story archetype, where the point is that the hero must face off against their own creation, thereby confronting the consequences of their own hubris for thinking that they can play God, as you get in a story like Ex Machina.
Come on, Caleb!
Basically, it's a reverse of a man versus supernatural story, and it's really one of the rarest story archetypes you come by, because at this point we all kind of know how those stories are going to end, even if you throw Nick Cage into the mix just to spice things up a bit.
Hey, listen, I'm not worried about you, so don't be concerned about me. Because I'm not concerned if you're not concerned, so don't worry, because I'm not really concerned.
So anyway, these are the 6 story archetypes, and like rom-coms and slasher films, each archetype has its own set of tropes and implications that make certain types of stories much easier to tell. For instance, instead of say a man versus society story where the opposition is more of an abstract concept or philosophical idea,
How do I reach these kids?
a man versus man story presents a singular point of conflict centered around the bad guys. And this singular point of conflict means that all the heroes really need to do to win is to defeat them. This is why most war stories and just about all action movies in general are so often tooled to be man versus man stories. Because unlike a man versus supernatural story, where facing off against one's own destiny can be a little bit more of a nebulous thing to establish, and even more nebulouser to conclude, all you really need to do to set up a man versus man story is a shot of the good guys being good and a shot of the bad guys being bad, and then you can just jump right into all the action sequences without leaving anyone wondering what's going on or where the story's going. Bonus points if you dress everyone up in black and white. Now, the problem in Dunkirk's case, though, was that despite it being a war movie, it didn't make for a very good man versus man story. Because for one, it's not so much about good guys fighting bad guys, it's more about the good guys running away. But two, and more importantly, the story is less about the action and much more about the manipulation of tension. This is the reason that Nolan exchanged all of that dialogue and character arcs for long shots of helmets on the beach and characters sitting around waiting for some dude to walk into the ocean. Because Nolan's entire focus from the outset wasn't to make a story about a bunch of guys killing Nazis, as much fun as those are to watch, but instead to recreate the feeling of the steadily increasing helplessness that the soldiers at Dunkirk must have felt, being cut off from escape as the enemy slowly closed in around them. Or, to put it in writing terms, what Nolan was trying to do here was to create a feeling of constantly rising tension across the entire film. And the key ingredient he used to achieve this centered around an editing technique based on the sound effect you're hearing right now, called a shepherd tone.
The structure I settled on is one that it's based on a musical structure called the shepherd tone, which is a musical illusion whereby you can keep climbing up the scale.
Essentially, the shepherd tone works by taking 3 different rising tones, each separated by an octave, and layering them on top of each other in a weird kind of musical sandwich in such a way that it gives the illusion of a single constantly rising sound.
So you're continually going up the scale, but you never seem to go out of reach, if you like.
Now, Nolan loves the shepherd tone about as much as he loves playing with time and guys in masks. In fact, like those other things, he's used it throughout his entire filmmaking career, with things like the sound of Batman's Batpod in the Dark Knight trilogy, to more generally the soundtracks of his films. For Dunkirk, though, Nolan decided to go all in on the shepherd tone by incorporating the concept into the story itself. He did this by splitting up the story into 3 separate fronts: air, sea, and, well, he calls it the mole, but basically it's land. And then he combined those 3 fronts in a similar way that a shepherd tone combines its 3 different tones.
And I wanted to try and apply that to screenwriting, to a narrative, and say, okay, with this story, can you braid together the 3 storylines in such a way that you create the idea of a continuing rise in intensity narratively?
It's not a perfect translation, of course, because you can't play 3 different story arcs simultaneously in film, but Nolan was at least able to create a reasonable facsimile of it by jumping back and forth between them. For instance, once things start to calm down after a high-tension dogfight in the air, Nolan jumps immediately over to land, right when everyone is about to get attacked by some planes. And then, once that's over and things start to calm down there, he jumps immediately over to the sea, just as a ship is about to get torpedoed. And he keeps doing this, jumping in and out of fronts as tensions wax and wane throughout the entire film. This is why the story jumps from night to day to night again, seemingly at random as the story goes. Because for once, Nolan wasn't worried so much about time, but instead about how the tension of each of these scenes would translate to the next one. Meaning that instead of the usual distribution of tension you see in a typical story, what we get in Dunkirk is something much more like this. It's an interesting and unique approach to storytelling, but it also meant that Dunkirk could not be a man versus man story, because all of those core elements that people have come to expect from that archetype run counter to this very idea. Remember, as we talked about before, a man versus man story implies a main source of conflict in a villain, and this singular source of conflict implies a clear path to success, which in Dunkirk's case would then lead the audience to ask, why don't these characters just fight back? I mean, this is, after all, the theme of most war movies. The good guys are put into a seemingly unwinnable situation against a horde of bad guys, only for them to miraculously fight their way out of it. For Nolan, though, the last thing that he wanted was for the audience to be expecting the characters to just go all 80s action hero and start dropping bodies and puns like it was going out of style.
Yeah. Stick around.
Or, even worse, for the audience to be expecting these characters to make a valiant last stand and go out in a blaze of glory. Instead, he wanted the audience to feel trapped alongside these characters, believing that there is no way to escape, and even the slightest possibility that there might be an alternative to this outcome would destroy that carefully constructed illusion. This is why putting enemy soldiers in Dunkirk would have been a huge mistake for Nolan. Because for the same reason that dressing a character up in white and making them really ridiculously good looking makes us assume that they are good, thanks to pretty much every other war movie in the history of cinema being a man versus man story, the moment that enemy soldiers started appearing on screen, the implication for the audience would be that they were dealing with a man versus man story, which would then mean that they would be expecting all of the usual man versus man story elements and those implications as well.
We're not here.
So here Nolan was faced with a problem. He could try to put the soldiers in anyway, and then spend the rest of the film fighting all of the implications that this specific archetype presented, by coming up with ways of subverting the audience's expectations in the same way that Scream deconstructs slasher films, which would, in all likelihood, end up taking a bunch of his time and most of the movie to do, or he could just cut out all the soldiers entirely, leaving no possibility for the audience to misconstrue what kind of story Dunkirk was, because, as it turns out, you can't have a man versus man story without a man for the heroes to face. This is why Dunkirk is such an interesting film, because it approaches the issue of tropes and the implications they entail differently than most other stories. See, most writers deal with these issues by flipping a trope on its head or giving us a different perspective on it. But the problem with this way of doing things is that these writers are still relying on these tropes to tell their story. Scream, for all its trope subversion with the Drew Barrymore fake-out, still has a final girl who makes it through to the end. It also does things like poke fun at the fact that the monster always comes back in the end.
This is the moment when the supposedly dead killer comes back to life.
But then it actually has the monster come back. And while it does it in an interesting way by then having another fake out on top of that, this doesn't negate the fact that the film is still using these tropes to tell its story. With Dunkirk, though, Nolan instead asked the question, what if the best solution for dealing with the implications of a trope isn't always to flip it on its head? What if the best solution was just to remove it altogether? And this is what we get in Dunkirk, a story that is stripped of pretty much all the things that we've come to expect in a good story, like character arcs and dialogue and even tropes. And yet, it still somehow manages to work, because by removing those aspects, Nolan was allowed the freedom to tell the story that he wanted to tell, in the way that he wanted to tell it. And in doing so, he was able to create a unique look at war, something that was less a narrative-driven story and much more a cinematic experience. Or, as Nolan put it, virtual reality without the headset. And with that, folks, we have come to the end of our... wait, actually, hold on a second. I think we're missing something here. Oh yes, so we do have one more thing that we need to talk about, and that is what archetype Dunkirk actually is. Because as fun as it is to talk about what Dunkirk is not, looking at what archetype Dunkirk falls into is actually far more interesting. Now, at this point, we know it's not a man versus man story, because of all the reasons I've already laid out.
You serious? I just told you that a moment ago.
But we can also toss out man versus supernatural here, because there's no gods. And we can also get rid of man versus machine as well, because there are no robots either. And while we're at it, we can go ahead and toss out man versus society too, because there are no societal issues that the characters face in this story, which leaves us with two options left, man versus self and man versus nature. Now, of course, there is an argument for man versus self here, because there are some elements of it in the film, like in this scene with the British soldiers trying to throw the French ones out of the ship, or this scene with Scarecrow trying to turn the boat around. But these aren't really the main focus of the film. Remember, to keep things really simple, Nolan stripped away nearly all of the character arcs in this story, only leaving in those few that would directly help him with manipulating tension. And that's mostly why these moments are here, not to provide commentary, but to pump up the tension with an extra few layers of that sweet, sweet conflict. So this leaves us with one archetype left, man versus nature. And I know this might sound a little ridiculous, that Dunkirk, a war movie about a battle between two opposing armies, could possibly fall under this archetype, being that most man versus nature stories are about, men trying to survive against actual nature. But remember, like we talked about before with the term man in my awesome Nick Cage-aganza on conflict archetypes, a word like nature here is just a term that acts as a stand-in for a much more nebulous concept. In the same way that a man versus man story doesn't actually need to be between two men, nature in a man versus nature story doesn't actually need to be a literal force of nature. It simply needs to be something that acts like one. And if you think about it, having the characters face off against something that acts like nature is far more fitting for Dunkirk than for the characters to face off against a bunch of humans. For one, there is a major limitation on how much damage humans can cause. Sure, people are capable of some truly horrible things, but there's a physical limitation on what they're able to do. You're never, for instance, going to be worried about a couple soldiers with guns somehow blowing up the entire planet. And if you can get away from them, you really don't need to worry about them at all. On top of that, humans can be reasoned with, they have a conscience, and they can even feel remorse. Nature, on the other hand, doesn't have any of these same limitations. It has the ability to inflict untold amounts of damage in the blink of an eye, and there's really no way to convince it not to. You can't strike a deal with nature, or bring it around to your way of thinking, or make it feel remorse. Also, there's no way to hide from it either. Nature can strike from anywhere at any time without warning. And finally, there is no winning against nature. A human you can kill, and you generally don't have to worry too much about them after that. But with nature, the best you can really hope for is to not die. The only way to succeed against it is to survive. As you can see, this all fits perfectly into the story that Dunkirk was trying to tell. A story that is more about human survival against insurmountable odds and facing off against an opponent who could appear suddenly from out of nowhere to kill them than it is about good guys fighting a bunch of bad guys. And this is where we get to the crux of the reason why Nolan chose to keep the enemy soldiers off screen for almost the entire story, and why, when he was finally forced to do so at the end, because we needed to see Tom Hardy getting captured as a consequence for his self-sacrifice, Nolan made sure to blur the soldiers' faces, because he wanted the German army to appear as inhuman as possible. It's the same reason why horror stories so rarely feature a human character as the antagonist, and why when they do, the story goes out of its way to make them appear and act as animalistic as possible, because humans simply aren't as scary as a supernatural monster or an act of God. So by stripping away the villain's humanity and giving them traits that we're used to seeing in evil monsters, or in Dunkirk's case, natural disasters, the story can effectively force the audience to view them as those more terrifying entities. In essence, what Nolan managed to do here was to use our own understanding of how stories work to turn the German army from a group of humans into a force of nature. And he was able to do all that because of the implication. Thanks for watching.